Distance is the cruelest thief of all. It steals time and it steals goodbyes. For Samuel Morse, it stole his entire world. He was a painter of light, capturing the soul of a nation on canvas. But while he worked in Washington, a letter traveled too slowly through the snow. It arrived 7 days late. His beloved wife was not just gone, she was buried. He stood over her grave, a man defeated by the vastness of America. In that silence, the painter died and the visionary was born. He vowed to weave the lightning into words, to make the world small enough that love could finally outrun the wind. Samuel Finley Breese Morse was born on the 27th of April, 1791, in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a place where the shadow of the Puritans still stretched long and cold over the cobblestones. He was the eldest son of Jedediah Morse, a man who was a towering figure in the early American Republic. Jedediah was a hellfire preacher of the Calvinist faith, rigorous, unyielding, and terrifyingly intellectual. He was also known as the father of American geography, having penned the textbooks that taught a young nation how to see itself. In the Morse household, idleness was a sin, and art was considered a frivolous waste of time, a vanity that distracted the soul from the glory of God. But young Samuel had a problem. He possessed a pair of hands that refused to sit still, and eyes that saw the world not in verses of scripture, but in light, shadow, and color. From the moment he could hold a piece of chalk, he was scratching faces onto the furniture, carving likenesses into wood, and sketching his classmates when he should have been reciting his catechisms. It was a compulsion, a frantic need to capture the human spirit on a flat surface. Jedediah looked at his son's scribbles with deep disapproval. He had a plan for Samuel, and that plan involved a pulpit, not a pallet. In 1805, at the tender age of 14, Samuel was sent to Yale College. His father hoped that the rigorous curriculum of logic, philosophy, and theology would crush the artistic nonsense out of him. But Yale in the early 19th century was a place of intellectual ferment, and instead of extinguishing Samuel's fire, it only gave him more fuel. While his professors droned on about the intricacies of religious law, Samuel was busy painting. He turned his dormitory room into a clandestine studio. He discovered that his classmates were willing to pay for his distractions. He charged $1 for a simple profile and $5 for a miniature on ivory. It was good money, but more importantly, it was validation. Yet amidst the paint and the rebellion, something else happened at Yale, something that seemed insignificant at the time, but would one day alter the course of human history. Samuel attended the lectures of Benjamin Silliman and Jeremiah Day, two of the leading scientific minds of the day. They were experimenting with a mysterious new force known as electricity. In a dim lecture hall, Samuel watched with wide eyes as they used batteries and static machines to produce sparks, to make dead frog legs twitch, and to simulate lightning. They spoke of electricity as a fluid, a strange, invisible river that could flow through wire. To most students, it was a carnival trick, a bit of scientific theater. But for Samuel Morse, it lodged a question in the back of his mind. If this fluid could travel instantly, could it carry a message? However, that was a question for another lifetime. Upon graduation in 1810, the weight of his father's expectations came crashing down. Jedediah Morse dragged Samuel back to Charlestown and apprenticed him to a bookseller in Boston. It was a sentence of drudgery. Samuel spent his days hauling crates and tallying ledgers, surrounded by words he didn't want to read, while his fingers itched for a brush. He wrote letters home that were practically screams for help. He told his parents that he was not made for business, that he would rather be a beggar than a merchant. He worked on a large painting of the landing of the Pilgrims in secret, hiding it like contraband. The Battle of Wills lasted for a year of misery, sullen silences, and secret sketches. Finally faced with his son's absolute despondency, and perhaps recognizing that no amount of prayer would turn a painter into a bookseller, Jedediah relented. He agreed to let Samuel sail for England to study at the Royal Academy under the great Benjamin West. It was a victory. Samuel Morse boarded the ship Lydia in 1811, leaving the strictures of Puritan New England behind. He believed he was sailing toward his destiny as the American Michelangelo. He had no idea that his true masterpiece would not be painted on canvas, but tapped out in silence on a copper wire. London in 1811 was the center of the civilized world, a sprawling, smoky metropolis where the streets echoed with the carriages of dukes and the arguments of philosophers. For 20-year-old Samuel Morse, escaping the suffocating piety of his father's house in Massachusetts, this was not just a city, it was paradise. He enrolled at the Royal Academy, the holy temple of British art. Under the tutelage of the legendary Benjamin West, an American expatriate who had become the favorite painter of King George III, Morse flourished. He was no longer the preacher's son scribbling in the margins of a hymnal. He was an artist. He worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by the belief that he was destined to bring the grandeur of the European Renaissance back to the raw soil of America. His moment of glory came quickly. In 1812, he modeled a sculpture of the dying Hercules, a masterpiece of muscular tension and agony. He then painted a massive canvas of the same subject. The British critics, usually dismissive of colonial upstarts, were stunned. The Society of Arts awarded him the gold medal, one of the highest honors an artist could receive. Morse stood in the great halls of London, applauded by the elite, convinced that he had conquered the summit. He wrote home to his parents with the arrogance of youth, declaring that he would never degrade his art by painting mere portraits. He would paint history, he would paint myths, he would paint the sublime. In 1815, with the gold medal tucked safely in his trunk and his head filled with visions of glory, Samuel Morse sailed back to the United States. He expected a hero's welcome. He expected the young republic to embrace him as its cultural messiah. He walked straight into a brick wall. America in 1815 was not London. It was a nation of farmers, merchants, and pioneers. It was a country obsessed with the practical, with the tangible, with the profitable. When Morse opened his studio in Boston, he displayed his massive historical paintings, The Judgment of Jupiter and The Dying Hercules. Crowds came to see them. They marveled at the technique. They said, "How nice," and then they left without buying a single thing. Morse quickly realized a brutal truth about the American art market. The American people did not care about Greek gods. They did not care about Roman history, and they certainly did not care about high art. They cared about themselves. The only way an artist could survive in the United States was to become a vanity machine, to paint portraits. Americans wanted their faces captured for posterity. They wanted to see their new wealth reflected in oil paint. They didn't want myths. They wanted mirrors. For a man who had sworn never to degrade his talent, this was a humiliation. But hunger is a persuasive master. Morse was forced to pack up his dreams of high culture and hit the road. He became an itinerant painter, a traveling salesman of his own talent. He left New England and traveled south to Charleston, South Carolina, a city of plantation wealth and Southern aristocracy. Here the money was good, but the work was soul-crushing. He painted 60 portraits in a single season, churning them out like a factory worker. He captured the likenesses of wealthy planters, their wives, and their children. He was selling his skill by the square inch. He wrote to a friend, "I am painting from morning until night. I have no time for the higher branches of art." But the tragedy wasn't just artistic, it was geographical. To chase these commissions, to earn the money to support his growing family, Morse had to live a life of constant motion. He was always leaving, always saying goodbye. In 1818, He had married Lucretia Pickering Walker, a woman of surpassing beauty and kindness. She was his muse. The dying Hercules was replaced in his heart by the living Lucretia. But a painter cannot paint if he stays in one place. And in America, the patrons were scattered across thousands of miles of wilderness. So Morse spent his marriage on the road, in Washington, in New York, in Charleston, writing letters home that took weeks to arrive. He was building a reputation as the finest portrait painter in America, but he was doing it at the cost of his presence. He was conquering the market, but he was losing time. And in the vast silence between his letters and Lucretia's replies, the distance was growing, waiting for the moment to strike. The gold medal in his trunk was gathering dust, a reminder of the London dream that had died on the rocky shores of American reality. He was a success, but he was a lonely success. And the wires that would one day connect the world were still just a phantom in his imagination. The year was 1825, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Samuel Morse had finally defeated the curse of the starving artist. He was in Washington, D.C., standing in a room that smelled of turpentine and expensive tobacco, painting the most famous man in the Western world, the Marquis de Lafayette. This was the commission of a lifetime. Lafayette was the hero of the American Revolution, the French aristocrat who had fought beside Washington. He was currently on a grand tour of the United States, and the city of New York had paid Morse the princely sum of $1,000 to capture his likeness. Morse was ecstatic. He wrote home to his wife Lucretia in New Haven, Connecticut, telling her that his days of struggle were over. He told her that he loved her, that he missed her, and that he was working as fast as he could so he could return to her with his pockets full of gold. He mailed the letter, and he waited for her reply. Lucretia was 25 years old, beautiful, kind, and recovering from the birth of their third child. She was the anchor of his chaotic life, the one person who believed in his genius when the rest of the world only saw a drifter. Days passed. Morse painted the heavy eyelids and the noble brow of the Marquis. He checked the post every morning, expecting a letter filled with news of the baby and domestic trivia. Then on February 9th, a letter finally arrived. But it was not from Lucretia. It was from his father, Jedediah Morse. Samuel broke the wax seal, his hands likely stained with the pigments of the Lafayette portrait. He expected news, perhaps a request for money or a lecture on morality. Instead, he read a sentence that would stop his heart. "My heart is in pain and deeply sorrowful, while I announce to you the sudden and unexpected death of your dear and loved wife." The words didn't make sense. Lucretia was young, she was healthy, but the ink on the page was cold and final. She had died of a sudden heart attack while recovering from the birth. But the horror was not just in the death, it was in the date. His father had written the letter on February 7th. Lucretia had died days before that. By the time Samuel was holding the paper in his trembling hands in Washington, his wife had already been dead for nearly a week. While he had been mixing colors, while he had been laughing with Lafayette, while he had been sleeping peacefully in his boarding house, the love of his life had been fighting for breath and losing. He packed his brushes. He left the portrait of Lafayette unfinished, a ghost of a painting that still hangs in New York City Hall today. And he began the journey home. In 1825, there were no trains. There were no highways. There was only the brutal reality of the American landscape. Morse boarded a stagecoach, then a horse, racing north through the freezing mud of a February winter. It was a journey of 300 miles. Imagine that ride. 300 miles of silence. 300 miles of not knowing. Every rattle of the carriage wheels, every beat of the horse's hooves mock him. He was traveling at the speed of a horse, but death travels at the speed of silence. He prayed that he would make it in time. Not to save her, he knew that was impossible, but just to see her face one last time, to kiss her cold forehead, to whisper the goodbye that had been stolen from him. It took him 6 days to get from Washington to New Haven. 6 days of hell. When he finally arrived at his home, exhausted, covered in road dust, his eyes red from weeping, he found the house silent. The curtains were drawn. Family members looked at him with pity in their eyes. He asked where she was. They pointed to the graveyard. Because the news had traveled so slowly, and because the journey had taken so long, the funeral was already over. Lucretia had been buried days ago. Samuel Morse walked to the cemetery alone. He stood over a patch of disturbed earth, a fresh mound of dirt that covered the woman he worshipped. He had missed everything. He had missed her last breath. He had missed her funeral. He had missed the chance to hold her hand. He was a man who had dedicated his life to capturing moments, to painting faces so they would live forever. But he had failed to capture the only moment that mattered. He stood there in the cold Connecticut wind, and something inside him broke. But in that breakage, something else was revealed, a dark and terrible realization. The enemy wasn't the heart attack. The enemy wasn't God. The enemy was distance. Why should a message take a week to travel 300 miles? Why should information be tied to the speed of an animal? It was medieval, it was cruel, and it was unacceptable. Samuel Morse dried his tears. He went back to painting for a while because he had children to feed. But the artist was dying. The romantic who believed in Greek myths and oil paints was being buried alongside Lucretia. In his place, a fanatic was rising, a man who would eventually look at the lightning in the sky and wonder if he could tame it, not to paint it, but to make it speak. He swore to himself that he would find a way to kill distance before it could kill him again. The seed of the telegraph was not planted in a laboratory, it was planted in a grave. It is October of 1832. The packet ship Sully is plowing through the gray swells of the Atlantic Ocean, heading west from Le Havre to New York. On board is a collection of wealthy travelers, merchants, and weary expatriates. Among them is Samuel Morse. He is 41 years old now. His hair is thinning and his heart is heavy. He has spent 3 years in Europe trying to revive his artistic career, painting the Gallery of the Louvre, hoping to bring the masterpieces of the old world to the American public. But deep down, he knows the truth. The American public doesn't care. He is returning home broke, disillusioned, and still haunted by the ghost of Lucretia. The Atlantic is a vast, indifferent void. It takes a month to cross, a month of creaking timber, howling winds, and absolute isolation. In 1832, a ship in the middle of the ocean is the loneliest place on earth. If the Sully sank, no one in New York would know for weeks. This reality of disconnection was the water Morse swam in. But history rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. Sometimes it starts with a casual conversation over a dinner table. One evening in the saloon, the conversation turned to science. Sitting opposite Morse was a young man named Dr. Charles Thomas Jackson, a brilliant, arrogant Bostonian who had been studying in Paris. Jackson was eager to show off his new knowledge. He began talking about the latest experiments in Europe, specifically the work of André-Marie Ampère and the properties of the electromagnet. Jackson described how electricity could pass through a length of wire wound in a coil, making a piece of iron magnetic for an instant, and then losing that magnetism the moment the circuit was broken. He spoke of sparks, of invisible forces, and of the mysterious fluid that Franklin had toyed with. Morse listened politely at first. He was a painter, not a physicist. But then Jackson said something that made the hair on the back of Morse's neck stand up. He mentioned the speed of the current. Morse leaned forward, his artist's hands gripping the edge of the table. "Dr. Jackson," he asked, "does the velocity of electricity retard along the length of the wire?" Jackson shook his head. "No," he replied. "Experiments have shown that electricity passes instantly over any known length of wire." Instantly. The word hung in the air. Cigars were smoking. Brandy was being poured. But for Samuel Morse, the room had vanished. All he could see was that word. Instantly. If electricity could travel instantly, and if its presence could be made visible by a spark or a magnet at the other end, then why couldn't it carry intelligence? Why couldn't it carry a message? The pieces of the puzzle that had been scattered across his life suddenly snapped together. The lectures at Yale, the grief of Lucretia's delayed letter, the humiliation of the Pony Express. The solution wasn't better horses, it wasn't faster ships, it was the lightning itself. If the presence of electricity can be made visible in any part of the circuit, Morse declared to the table, though he was really speaking to himself, I see no reason why intelligence may not be transmitted instantaneously by electricity. The other passengers nodded politely and went back to their drinks. They thought it was just a philosophical musing, a what-if from an eccentric artist. But Morse did not go back to his drink. He stood up, excusing himself from the table, and walked out onto the deck. The wind was cold. The ocean was black and endless, but his mind was on fire. He paced the deck, muttering to himself. He wasn't thinking about brushstrokes anymore. He was thinking about signs, about codes, about a language of interruptions. He retreated to his cabin. He didn't sleep. He pulled out his artist's sketchbook, the same book he used to draw landscapes and faces. And on a fresh page, he began to draw something else. He sketched a crude battery, a wire, and an electromagnet. He drew a system of levers. He realized that electricity could only do two things. It could be on or it could be off. It was a binary force. So the language had to be binary too. Short bursts and long bursts, dots and dashes. Right there, in the belly of a wooden ship tossing on the Atlantic, the telegraph was born. The concept of the Morse code was scribbled into the margin of an art book. When the Sully finally docked in New York Harbor a few weeks later, the captain shook Morse's hand and said, I hope to see you again soon, Mr. Morse. Morse looked at him, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. Captain, he said, should you hear of the telegraph one of these days as the wonder of the world, remember the discovery was made on board the good ship Sully. He walked down the gangplank, leaving his paints behind. He had boarded the ship as an artist. He stepped off as an inventor, and he was ready to declare war on distance. But he had no idea that the battle ahead would cost him his friends, his reputation, and nearly his sanity. The idea was perfect on paper, but the world was about to prove much harder to wire than a sketchbook. New York City, 1835. The dream of the telegraph had moved from the open ocean to a dusty, unheated room in the tower of the university building at Washington Square. Samuel Morse was now a professor of literature of the arts of design at New York University. It was a fancy title, but it paid almost nothing. The man who had dined with Lafayette was now living the life of a pauper. He slept on a cot in his studio. He cooked meager meals of tea and crackers over a stove that he also used to heat his chemicals. He hid his poverty from his students, pretending to be busy with commissions when he was actually building a machine out of trash. His first prototype was pathetic. It was a Frankenstein's monster of an invention. He used an old canvas stretcher for the frame. He used the wheels from a wooden clock to move the paper ribbon, and his electromagnet was wrapped in common milliner's wire. When he turned it on, it clicked. It scratched a mark on the paper, but it could barely send a signal across the room, let alone across a continent. Morse was a painter. He understood light and shadow, but he did not understand the physics of resistance. Every time he tried to extend the wire, the signal died. The electricity simply faded away before it reached the receiver. He was trying to push a boulder up a hill with a piece of string. He needed a team, and in the true spirit of American innovation, he found them right in his own backyard. First came Leonard Gale, a chemistry professor at NYU. Gale looked at Morse's battery, a single weak cell, and shook his head. He introduced Morse to the work of Joseph Henry. He showed him how to wire batteries in a series, creating a voltage strong enough to punch through the resistance. Suddenly, the signal could travel for miles, not just feet. Then came Alfred Vail, a student who wandered into the studio one day and saw the clicking machine. Vail wasn't just a curious observer. He was the son of the owner of the Speedwell Ironworks. He had money, and more importantly, he had mechanical genius. Vail looked at Morse's crude wooden frame and offered a deal. He would put up the capital and build a proper machine in his father's factory in exchange for a share of the patent. Morse agreed. The artist had found his engineer, but the machine was useless without a language. Initially, Morse had a clumsy idea. He wanted to use a code book. He thought he would send numbers, 1, 5, 7, and the operator at the other end would have to look up number 157 in a massive dictionary to see that it meant freedom. It was slow. It was tedious. It was like trying to speak by looking up every word in a thesaurus. It was here that the team had their true eureka moment. They realized they didn't need words. They needed letters. But sending 26 different electrical signals was impossible. They only had one signal. The circuit was closed or it was open, on or off, a dot or a dash. To make this efficient, they had to think like a computer, long before computers existed. They needed to know which letters were used the most. So Morse and Vail went to a local newspaper office in Morristown. They didn't go to read the news. They went to look at the typesetter's cases. They looked at the little bins where the metal letters were stored. They noticed immediately that the bin for the letter E was overflowing. It was the biggest bin in the case. The bin for the letter Z was tiny, dust gathering in the corners. The logic hit them with the force of a revelation. If E is the most common sound in the English language, it should have the shortest signal. E became one single dot. T, the next most common, became one single dash. Z, the rarest, became a complex sequence. Dot, dash, dot, dot. This was not just a code. It was data compression. They were optimizing the flow of information based on frequency. It was a stroke of analytical brilliance that turned a clumsy clicking noise into a fluid language. A good operator could tap out E in a fraction of a second, while a rare word would take longer. The rhythm of the code mirrored the rhythm of human speech. But there was one final hurdle. The signal still faded over long distances. No battery on Earth could push a current from New York to New Orleans. The resistance of the wire would eventually choke it. Morse came up with the repeater, or the relay. It was a concept so simple it was beautiful. He realized he didn't need one long wire. He could use a series of short wires. At the end of the first 10 miles, the dying signal would flow into a magnet. That magnet would have just enough strength to close a switch. That switch would open a gate for a brand new, fresh battery to fire a strong signal down the next 10 miles. And so on, and so on. It was like a bucket brigade for electricity. The signal could be refreshed, reborn, and carried infinitely around the globe. By 1838, in the smoky workshops of the Speedwell Ironworks, the machine was finished. It wasn't a canvas stretcher anymore. It was a sleek device of brass and mahogany, and it spoke a language of dots and dashes that was faster than thought. Samuel Morse had started with nothing but a canvas stretcher and a dead wife's memory. Now he had a voice that could scream across the silence. He was ready to show the world. But the world, as always, was slow to listen. It was the night of March 3rd, 1843. The mood in Washington, D.C. was chaotic. It was the final session of Congress, the lame duck session. Bills were being passed or killed in a frenzy of shouting and gavel banging. In the gallery, a 51-year-old Samuel Morse sat watching the clock. He was penniless. He had spent years lobbying, begging, and demonstrating his machine to skeptical politicians who thought he was a lunatic. He needed $30,000 to build a test line. If the clock struck midnight without a vote, the bill would die, and so would the telegraph. Morse waited until the final minutes, losing hope. He walked back to his boarding house, defeated. He paid his bill with his last few coins and prepared to leave Washington forever. But the next morning, a young woman named Annie Ellsworth ran up to him at breakfast. She was the daughter of the patent commissioner. Her face was glowing. "I have news," she said. "Your bill passed." It was the very last act of the session. Morse nearly wept. The government had given him $30,000. It was a fortune. But it was also a challenge. Now he had to prove it wasn't a magic trick. For the next year, Morse and his team worked like men possessed. They dug trenches. They strung wires on poles along the railroad tracks from Washington to Baltimore. 40 miles of copper, 40 miles of opportunity. On May 24th, 1844, the stage was set. Morse sat in the Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol building, surrounded by a crowd of dignitaries who were holding their breath. At the other end of the line, in Baltimore, Alfred Vail was waiting at the receiver. Morse placed his finger on the key. The room went silent. This was the moment. He wasn't painting a portrait anymore. He was painting history. Annie Ellsworth had chosen the message, a phrase from the Book of Numbers. It was heavy, biblical, and perfect for the magnitude of the event. Morse began to tap. Dot, dash, dash, dot, dot. The brass lever clicked rhythmically. It sounded like a clock ticking, but it was the heartbeat of a new age. In Baltimore, the paper ribbon began to unspool. Alfred Vail read the marks. He turned to the crowd in the railroad depot and read the words aloud. "What hath God wrought?" Back in Washington, the confirmation signal returned instantly. The crowd erupted. Men threw their hats in the air. For the first time in the history of the human species, a thought had traveled faster than a messenger. It had traveled at the speed of light. 40 miles had vanished in a fraction of a second. The ghost of Lucretia's delayed letter was finally exorcised. Morse had done it. He had killed distance. But if Morse thought his struggles were over, he was naive. He had conquered nature, but now he had to conquer human greed. The moment the telegraph proved profitable, the vultures descended. Everyone wanted to own the lightning. Rival companies sprang up overnight, ignoring Morse's patents, stringing up their own wires, and claiming they had invented the technology first. They called Morse a fraud, a painter who stole ideas from real scientists like Joseph Henry. The worst of these battles was O'Reilly versus Morse. Henry O'Reilly was an Irish-born businessman who had built a telegraph line from Philadelphia to St. Louis without paying Morse a dime. He argued that Morse was trying to patent a law of physics, that no man could own the rights to electromagnetism itself. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was a brutal, ugly fight. Morse's reputation was dragged through the mud. He was accused of theft, of incompetence, of being a charlatan. The stress was so immense that he suffered from blinding neuralgic headaches that left him prostrate for days. But in the end, it was the repeater that saved him. The Supreme Court looked at the mechanics. They agreed that you cannot patent the electric current. That belongs to God. But they ruled that Morse had invented the specific machinery that made that current useful over long distances. The relay system, the device that refreshed the dying signal, was the key. It was the undeniable proof of his genius. The court ruled in his favor. It was a total victory. The decision made Samuel Morse one of the wealthiest men in America. The starving artist who had once slept on a canvas stretcher was now a tycoon. He bought a sprawling estate in Poughkeepsie. He wore the finest clothes. He was celebrated as the American Aladdin. But there was a bitterness to the triumph. The telegraph had united the world, but the fight to own it had destroyed his friendships. He and Alfred Vail drifted apart, with Vail dying poor and unrecognized. Joseph Henry never spoke to him again. Morse had won the war. He had secured his legacy. He had proven that a painter could change the world. but he had learned a hard lesson. In America, innovation is only half the battle. The other half is the lawsuit, and sometimes the courtroom is colder than the grave. The year is 1871, Central Park, New York City. A massive crowd gathers to unveil a bronze statue. It is a monument to a hero, a man holding a strip of telegraph tape, and standing at the base of that statue, shivering in the cold wind, is the man himself, Samuel Morse. 80 years old, with a white beard flowing like a biblical patriarch. He is a living ghost attending his own canonization. He was the American Leonardo, the man who had woven the nerves of the planet. By 1866, his dream had crossed the final frontier. The Atlantic cable was laid, connecting New York to London. A message that once took weeks on a ship like the Sully now took minutes. He had united the continents. He was one of the most famous men alive, with a fortune of $500,000, a palace on the Hudson River, and medals from every king in Europe. But if you look closely at the old man's eyes, you didn't see the satisfaction of a conqueror. You saw the melancholy of a painter, and you saw the hardening of a soul. This is the final uncomfortable paradox of Samuel Morse. He was a man of contradictions so deep they threatened to tear him apart. The man who invented the machine that connected humanity was, in his private life, deeply suspicious of it. He spent his later years writing furious pamphlets against immigrants, warning that Catholics and foreigners were destroying the fabric of America. He argued that slavery was a divine institution ordained by the Bible. The man who erased the borders of communication spent his final political energy trying to build fences around his own country. He was a visionary in technology, but a relic in ideology. And then there was the regret, the quiet, gnawing regret that no amount of money could silence. In his final days, as he lay dying of pneumonia in his New York townhouse in April 1872, he didn't talk about the Telegraph. He didn't talk about the lawsuits. He talked about the canvas. He confessed to a friend, "The only regret I have in leaving the world is that I have not been able to make those contributions to art which I felt I was born to create." He didn't want to be remembered for the dot and the dash. He didn't want to be remembered as an engineer. He wanted to be remembered for the light in the shadow. He looked at his hands, hands that had changed the destiny of the human species, and he saw only failure, because they were hands that had stopped painting. He felt that he had sacrificed his true calling on the altar of a machine. History has a cruel sense of humor. Today, Morse's paintings hang in the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They are masterpieces, but nobody looks at them. Instead, we look at our phones. We look at the internet. We look at a world wrapped in fiber optics and satellites, a world that screams with information at the speed of light. Every text message you send, every email you write, every breaking news alert that flashes on your screen is a direct descendant of that crude machine built on a canvas stretcher in a freezing room at NYU. We are all living in the world Samuel Morse built. We speak his language of instant connection. But somewhere in the silence between the signals, if you listen closely, you can still hear the quiet weeping of the artist who just wanted to paint a picture, but ended up wiring the world. The telegraph killed the distance, but it also killed the painter. And perhaps that was the price the future demanded. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share to support me. See you in the next video. Have a good day.